Prince William, the Prince of Wales and the future of the British monarchy, has just executed a maneuver that no member of the British royal family has dared to attempt in the modern history of the United Kingdom. For centuries, the House of Windsor has operated under a doctrine of never complain, never explain, a survival mechanism that has allowed the institution to weather world wars, social revolutions, and internal scandals by remaining a silent, golden thread in the fabric of British life. But on this day, the silence was not just broken. It was shattered with a force that reset the geopolitical clock of the entire continent. He did not whisper his grievances through an anonymous spokesperson or a source close to the palace. He did not bury his fury in the sterile, passive-aggressive language of a carefully worded diplomatic cable designed to be read between the lines by academics and bureaucrats. He stood before the world and spoke directly, publicly, and without a single syllable of apology. He looked at the most powerful unelected woman in Europe, Ursula von der Leyen, and he effectively ended her authority in the eyes of the British people. It was not a political ending, nor was it a diplomatic one. It was a total moral and institutional severance. The moment those words landed, the gears of every government in Europe ground to a screeching halt. The usual bureaucratic hum of Brussels was replaced by the frantic, panicked ringing of phones in every embassy from Lisbon to Warsaw. Senior officials, who for years had operated under the smug and comfortable assumption that a post-Brexit Britain was weakened, isolated, and too terrified of its own economic shadow to fight back, suddenly felt the floor drop away from beneath them. They realized in a moment of cold, terrifying clarity that they had made the most catastrophic miscalculation of their political lives. Prince William was not bluffing, and he was not posturing for the cameras. He was not playing a complex game of diplomatic chess with hidden exits and safe retreats. Every word was a calculated strike, a precise application of institutional power that the European elite thought had been consigned to the history books. To understand why this sent such a violent shockwave through every capital in Europe, one must look at the spark that lit the fuse. This was not a dispute over fishing rights in the Channel, nor was it a disagreement over Northern Irish trade protocols or steel tariffs. It was a direct, existential assault on the British crown itself. The European Commission, led by von der Leyen's inner circle, had crossed a line that no serious political analyst thought they would ever touch. In a move of staggering arrogance and historical blindness, they publicly declared King Charles III to be unconstitutional. They stated on the record that the King of the United Kingdom holds no legitimate authority, no real power, and no place in any conversation that touches upon European interests. They treated a 1,000-year-old institution like an inconvenient administrative hurdle that could be dissolved with a simple press release. They told the British people that their monarch, the man who wore the crown in one of the most watched ceremonies in human history, was in their eyes nothing more than a ceremonial decoration with no real standing. This was not a mistake or a misworded sentence that a communications team failed to catch. This was coordinated, discussed, and deliberately deployed as a political message aimed directly at the heart of the British identity. Europe believed that Britain would absorb the humiliation and move on. They believed the royal family would retreat behind the high stone walls of Buckingham Palace and allow the political machinery of Westminster to smooth things over the way it always does. They relied on the assumption that the House of Windsor, bound by protocol and tradition, would never break its public silence to confront European leaders directly. In making that assumption, they made an error so fundamental that its consequences are still spreading across the continent like cracks through a foundation that was never as strong as it looked. Prince William did not retreat. He did not stay silent. He did not send a diplomat. He responded himself, using the language of a man who had decided that the relationship, as it currently existed, was no longer worth preserving on Europe's terms. He called Ursula von der Leyen exactly what she is, unelected. He did not dress it up or soften the blow. He stated the fact plainly and let it sit in the open air where everyone could see it. He pointed out that von der Leyen was not voted into her position by the citizens of Europe, but was selected behind closed doors by a circle of political elites. He then issued the ultimatum that sent every trade, official, and foreign minister in Europe reaching for their phones at the same time. He said Britain would not be leaving the insult unanswered, and that every single European deal currently in place was now under review. The frameworks, the agreements, and the cooperation structures that had been carefully constructed since Brexit were now sitting on the table, and Prince William was the one deciding whether they stayed there or whether they burned. The reaction inside Brussels was not the measured response of a political institution that had anticipated this outcome. It was panic, raw, immediate, and very poorly hidden panic. Staff who had been working through routine schedules suddenly found themselves summoned into emergency sessions. Senior advisors began pulling economic data they had not looked at in years, desperately trying to calculate what a genuine and complete breakdown in British and European relations would actually cost. The truth that those numbers revealed was something that Brussels had been carefully avoiding for years. Britain was not as dependent on European goodwill as European leaders had been claiming. The economic leverage that the Commission had always used as an invisible pressure point on British behavior was significantly smaller than the public narrative suggested. Prince William, standing behind the full moral weight of an institution that the British people love with a depth and consistency that no elected politician has ever managed to inspire, had just called Europe's bluff in front of the entire world. German industrial lobbyists were the first to sound the alarm internally. The automotive sector alone, Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, exports hundreds of thousands of vehicles into Britain every single year. If Britain began applying retaliatory measures to German goods, or if British ports started treating German imports with the kind of friction that made them uncompetitive against alternatives coming from America or Asia, the damage to Germany's already struggling industrial economy would be immediate and politically devastating. France understood its exposure just as quickly. French wine, French agricultural products, and French luxury goods flow into Britain in volumes that represent billions in annual revenue for French producers. The British consumer market is not a minor footnote in French economic planning. It is a critical pillar. Prince William's statement had just given every British consumer a reason to think about where their money was going and whether they wanted it going to a bloc that had just publicly humiliated their king. But the most dangerous aspect of this for the European Commission was the realization that Prince William was not acting alone. The silence coming from Buckingham Palace was not the silence of an institution caught off guard. It was a message that every experienced political observer understood the moment they recognized what was not being said. When a royal institution of the magnitude of the British monarchy chooses silence in a moment of crisis, it does not mean the institution is paralyzed. It means the decision has already been made at the highest level. King Charles III was not scrambling behind closed doors. His response was his son. He had not asked his son to stop, and that fact changed the entire geometry of the confrontation. It meant the crown itself had decided to push back. The House of Windsor was not retreating. It was advancing with the kind of unified, deliberate confidence that only comes from an institution that has survived things far more serious than a press release for Brussels. Inside 10, Downing Street, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was facing a situation that no briefing document had ever prepared him for. His entire approach to managing Britain's post-Brexit relationship had been built on patience and finding small areas of practical cooperation. Europe had just destroyed that baseline entirely. Sunak now had to decide what came next in a political environment where the royal family had already moved and the British public was watching to see whether their government would follow. He convened an emergency cabinet meeting within hours, and the room was there to decide how far Britain was prepared to go. The answer was further than any European government had modeled in any of their risk scenarios. British trade officials received formal instructions to begin a comprehensive, line-by-line review of every existing agreement with European Union member states. This was not a symbolic review designed to create negotiating pressure. It was an honest assessment of which frameworks Britain actually needed and which ones it could walk away from. The preliminary results showed that Britain had far more room to maneuver than Brussels had publicly acknowledged. The web of economic interdependence that the Commission had presented as an unbreakable constraint was significantly weaker than advertised. Britain could move, Britain could cut, and Britain could redirect trade in ways that would hurt Europe considerably more than they would hurt Britain itself. Germany felt this reality hardest. The German government had spent years positioning itself as the calm, reasonable center of European engagement, but that posture evaporated the moment industrial leaders began running their own numbers. The exposure of German manufacturing to British market access was a structural dependency. BMW alone employs tens of thousands of workers whose livelihoods are connected to the volume of vehicles sold in British showrooms. If Britain moved against German goods, the political fallout inside Germany would land on a government that was already dealing with an electorate that was restless and looking for someone to blame. France was running its own version of the same calculation and arriving at the same uncomfortable destination. The French agricultural lobby had built decades of export infrastructure around access to British consumers. Paris began making quiet, urgent calls to Brussels, and those calls were expressions of alarm. France was telling the Commission that the cost of von der Leyen's attack was rapidly becoming more than France was willing to absorb. Beyond the economic tremors, something was happening inside Britain that no spreadsheet could capture. The British public was not processing this as a political dispute, but as an attack on something they love. The monarchy is woven into the identity of the nation at a level that goes far deeper than politics. It is in the music, the ceremonies, and the stories of the people. When Europe attacked the crown, it attacked the living symbol of what Britain is. The British people responded with a clarity and a unity that their own politicians had not managed to inspire in years. Social media filled with consensus. Europe had gone too far, and Prince William was right to push back. The expressions of support came from across the political spectrum, from people who had voted for Brexit and people who had voted against it. The crown had done something almost impossible in modern politics. It had given a divided nation a single thing to stand behind. Von der Leyen was watching all of this from Brussels, and the reports coming back to her office were not reassuring. Her communications team had attempted one clarifying statement that had landed with a thud and changed nothing. The British government was reviewing trade, the royal family was not standing down, and the British public was unified. Prince William had said clearly that Britain had not yet played its most powerful card, and that statement hung over Europe like a shadow. Every strategist in Brussels was now obsessed with one question. What was that card? What was sitting inside Buckingham Palace that had not yet been revealed? The most powerful card was not merely a legislative threat or a tariff. It was the total withdrawal of British intelligence and security cooperation, the very backbone of European defense. For decades, the United Kingdom has provided the Five Eyes level of intelligence that shields the European continent from threats that many member states are unequipped to handle alone. By hinting that the Crown was reviewing every framework, William was subtly reminding Brussels that security is a two-way street. If the king is unconstitutional in the eyes of Europe, then perhaps the security umbrella provided by his armed forces and intelligence agencies is also an unnecessary decoration. This realization turned the panic in Brussels into a full-blown existential crisis. The European Union, for all its economic weight, lacks the integrated military and intelligence capability that Britain possesses. Without British cooperation, the security architecture of the continent would develop gaps that could take a generation to fill. The pressure on von der Leyen began to mount from within. Leaders of major European nations, realizing that their own economies and security were being sacrificed for a rhetorical attack on the British monarchy, began to distance themselves from the Commission's stance. The unified front of the EU began to show its seams. In Berlin and Paris, the narrative shifted from supporting the Commission to demanding an immediate de-escalation. They realized that they had provoked a lion that was perfectly comfortable in its own skin, led by a prince who understood that his duty was not to the niceties of European diplomacy, but to the sovereignty and dignity of his people. The Prince of Wales had effectively flipped the script. He had made the European Commission look like the isolated, weakened, and out-of-touch party. As the days passed, the silence from King Charles continued, but the activity within the British government accelerated. Shipments at the ports were scrutinized with a new, meticulous level of detail that caused massive backlogs for European exporters. British consumers began opting for domestic or non-European alternatives in a spontaneous display of national pride. The economic war that Europe thought it could win through intimidation was being won by Britain through sheer cultural and institutional resilience. The prince's words had acted as a catalyst for a national reawakening. Britain was no longer a nation asking for a seat at the table. It was a nation reminding the table that it owned the room. In the final assessment of this historic confrontation, the world saw a transformation of the British monarchy. It was no longer just a link to the past, but a guardian of the future. Prince William had demonstrated that the crown still possesses the power to speak for the nation in ways that politicians cannot. He had shown that when the foundations of the country are threatened, the House of Windsor will not stay silent. The shockwaves of his defiance will be felt for years, serving as a permanent reminder to any international power that the British people and their monarchy are an inseparable force. The most powerful card had been played, and its name was national unity. Europe is only now beginning to understand that you cannot dissolve 1,000 years of history with a press release, and you certainly cannot silence a prince who knows exactly who he is and who he represents. The era of British apology is over. The era of British assertion has begun, and it was led by the man who will one day, with a crown that Europe tried to claim was illegitimate. The story of Prince William's defiance is now the new blueprint for British sovereignty. It is a story of a prince who stood his ground, a king who backed his heir, and a nation that remembered its strength. Brussels, meanwhile, is left to pick up the pieces of a diplomatic strategy that shattered upon contact with the reality of the British spirit. The lesson for the world is clear. Never mistake silence for weakness, and never underestimate the power of a crown that is defended by the people it serves. The cracks in the European foundation are visible to all, and the balance of power has shifted back across the Channel, where it has resided for centuries and where, thanks to the Prince of Wales, it will remain for many more to come.